Hi. So in one of the leadership workshop that we ran last week, one of the attendees asked that I explain the Scrum framework in a few minutes, and that's what I'm going to try to do in this video. It is worth noting that I will not be able to cover the entirety of the Scrum framework, and particularly the Scrum values and the pillars of Scrum. Empiricism, which is transparency, inspection, and adaptation. I won't be covering those. But what I will try to cover in this video is what I call the mechanics of Scrum, which is the Scrum events, the artifacts, and I try to show the linkages between them, the rules that bind these things together. So let's start with the product backlog. The product backlog is the list of everything that the Scrum team and the stakeholders need to create or improve their product. And within the product backlog, you've got the product goal, which is the commitment for the product backlog. The product goal guides the emergence of the product backlog, right? So the Scrum team would present the product backlog in the sprint planning. And there are three questions the Scrum team would try to answer in the sprint planning, which is why, what, and how. The why is the sprint goal. And usually the product owner would present an objective for the sprint. The Scrum team would then collaborate to form a sprint goal from that objective as a whole. Then the developers would select items from the product backlog that they believe would help them deliver the sprint goal. And then the developers will go ahead to start breaking down these items into a plan for the sprint. So the sprint goal, the items selected, and the plan for converting those items into an increment is what formulates the sprint backlog. And then the sprint starts. On every day of the sprint, the developers would converge in an event called the Daily Scrum to inspect their progress towards the sprint goal and also create a plan for the next 24 hours. Right? The diagram that you see here depicts a Scrum team. One Scrum Master, one product owner, and more than one developers, ideally. Typically, your Scrum team should be 10 or less. Towards the end of the sprint, the Scrum team would endeavor to produce an increment, deliver an increment, right? A valuable increment, a usable increment that is guided by the definition of done. That is the commitment for the increment. All right. I've seen teams where the PBIs are broken down in such a manner that as soon as a PBI conforms to the definition of done, an increment is born, which means sometimes you can have multiple increments throughout the sprint. It depends on the context in which you work, right? The Scrum team then presents that increment in a sprint review, which is a working session between the Scrum team and the stakeholders. It is not a demo. A demo might happen within the sprint review, but the sprint review should not be taken for a demo. It's meant to be a meeting where the increment is inspected, the business conditions, budgets, progress towards the product goal could be discussed in there. And ultimately, one outcome you want to get from the sprint review is to adapt the product backlog. Are there any updates that's mandated for a deletion from the product backlog and to add more items to the backlog or to refine the items in the backlog? That's really the key output from the sprint review, and that's in preparation for the next sprint planning. After the sprint review, the Scrum team will then proceed to a sprint retrospective, which is an event where the Scrum team would inspect themselves, their processes, their tools. Sometimes a definition of done, right? And then at the end of the sprint retrospective, one or more improvements might be identified that the Scrum team might decide to take into the next sprint. And that really is the mechanics of the Scrum framework. And I must say this again, without the Scrum values, without empiricism, which underpins all of these events, yeah, what you have is mechanical Scrum. But it's a good foundation to understand what the framework is, what are the Scrum events, what are the rules that bind them, and what sort of artifacts are inspected, adapted throughout the sprints. Thank you very much, and I hope that was useful.